Yeah, thank you for coming. It's a very cozy crowd here. Good evening, and welcome to Greenlight Bookstore. We're excited to host tonight's event with Anastasia C. Curwood, presenting her new book, Shirley Chisholm, Champion of Black Feminist Power Politics. She'll be talking with Barbara Winslow, so you're in for an excellent evening. Before I turn things over, a couple of quick housekeeping things. Turn off or silence your cell phones, please. We encourage the use of masks. They are optional. And Barbara has kindly signed some books for us, so they are available for purchase at the register.
I signed them, not Barbara.
Not Barbara. Well, I'm about to introduce Barbara, so that's where Barbara's on the brain here. Barbara will sign the book that comes out this summer. How about that? Anastasia signs some books, though. Our interviewer for the evening is Barbara Winslow. Barbara is Professor Emerita of Women and Gender Studies at Brooklyn College, CUNY, and the founder and Director Emerita of Shirley Chisholm Project for Brooklyn Women's Activism at Brooklyn College. Her book, Revolutionary Feminists, A History of the Women's Liberation Movement, published by Duke, will be out this summer. She'll be speaking with our featured author, Anastasia C. Curwood. Curwood is Professor and Chair of History and Director of Commonwealth Institute for Black Studies at the University of Kentucky. She is the author of Stormy Weather, Middle-Class African-American Marriages Between the Two World Wars, UNC Press, and Shirley Chisholm, Champion of Black Feminist Power Politics, UNC Press, tonight's featured book. And in her newest book, Curwood interweaves Chisholm's public image. Yeah, show off that beautiful photo, that's right. Political commitments and private experiences to create a definitive account of a consequential life, shaking up New York and national politics by becoming the first African-American congresswoman and later, the first Black majority party presidential candidate. Shirley Chisholm left an indelible mark as an unbought and unbossed firebrand and a leader in politics for meaningful change. So we're in for a very special, intimate evening. I feel like I'm at a private dinner party here. I'm very lucky. Anastasia will read a passage from the book, and then Barbara will join in conversation, and if anyone has any questions, you'll be able to offer them after that. So please join me in welcoming to the stage, Anastasia.
Thank you. Okay, so this is my first time reading as a writer, so I'm actually pretty thrilled about this. And I'm going to read two passages from the book, one from Chisholm's origins, and then another one from deep in the tome. One of the most exciting moments, or a couple of moments leading up to the Democratic National Convention in 1972. So first I'm going to read from chapter 1. Chapter 1 is called Daughter of the Caribbean. As a girl, the two female public figures Shirley Chisholm looked up to most were Eleanor Roosevelt and Mary McLeod Bethune, both of whom she met at least once, and both highly influential in the histories of U.S. Black feminisms. Late in life, Chisholm would credit Roosevelt, Bethune, and her grandmother, Emmeline Seal, as the three women who had the most influence on her. Influence in terms of the things they said to me. Although the exact occasion remains unclear, Chisholm recalled that Roosevelt was present at an awards ceremony when the high school-age Shirley accepted a prize. As Chisholm told the story, the First Lady complimented her intellect and exhorted the teenage Shirley to never give up. Bethune, on an unspecified occasion, gave similar advice. These women also modeled womanhood that encompassed outspoken self-determination and, in the case of Roosevelt and Bethune, a deep engagement with public life. Roosevelt, a lifelong reformer and the wife of President Franklin Delano Roosevelt, asserted women's rights to participate in politics and media. Bethune was a builder of institutions and an advocate for Black women and men inside democratic politics. Bethune and Roosevelt shared with Chisholm the belief that the government ought to work in the service of the people, including women. Bethune in particular, as a president of the National Association of Colored Women and the founder of the National Council of Negro Women, represented an intersectional and pragmatic advocacy for Black women that informed Chisholm's Black feminist power politics. Bethune's emphasis on reforming government and institutions to support those with little power and wealth would become bedrock within Chisholm's own thinking. Years later, Chisholm would successfully sponsor a bill to erect the statue of Bethune that stands today in Washington, D.C.'s Lincoln Park. But it was from Emmeline Seal, her Barbadian grandmother, that she learned the value of family and of independence, both of which shaped her politics and her political vision. Shirley Chisholm's Black feminism grew organically from her family and place of origin. She was born in the United States to Barbadian parents and spent 6 years of her childhood on the island of Barbados. With a foot in two lands, Chisholm observed women's financial independence, how to maintain dignity in the midst of racism and poverty, how to succeed in school, and how to challenge authority. Her Barbadian grandmother taught her to be fearless about doing what she thought was right. Her Barbadian mother showed her single-minded tenacity. And her Barbadian father nurtured her intellect and her political education. 6 years as a child in Barbados imparted a simultaneous identity as Black and immigrant, and Chisholm saw common threads between both throughout her life. Having been raised by self-determined women, she thought every option could and should be open to her regardless of sex. But Shirley did not passively absorb the dictates of the adults in her life, no matter how much she respected them. Shirley's temperament, even as a young child, was opinionated, self-assured, and confident. Her feisty personality appalled her mother and some family members, even as it delighted others, such as her father and maternal grandmother. This would be the case throughout her life, when some thought her too egotistical and self-aggrandizing, while others admired her temerity and took inspiration from it. Young Shirley encountered her world with the conviction that she had the ability to make change, a belief that persisted well into her adult life. What she learned in girlhood built her sense of assertiveness over her own future. I'm going to skip ahead about 40-odd years. So this is from chapter 16. This is the Chisholm Coalition on the National Stage, Miami, 72. So I'll read the first couple paragraphs from this chapter. The 1972 Democratic National Convention in Miami had a completely different complexion from the one in 1968. Major reforms adopted after 1968's chaos and violence yielded a delegate body that was younger, more Black and brown, and more female. Out of 3,085 delegates at the DNC, 15% were Black, and 40% of the credentialed delegates were women. Both tripled percentages from 1968. Far fewer delegates held elected office in 1972 than they had in 1968. A symbol of the new inclusiveness, Yvonne Brathwaite, a Black woman and front-runner for a California congressional seat, was named DNC vice chair. This did not come without resentment from party officials and labor leaders, many of whom lost out to the newcomers. The result was a convention that was part aspirational and part conservative. Energy from those experiencing new levels of participation gave the convention an air of possibility. The front-runners were concerned with winning, and their policy positions and promises were secondary to this enterprise. But party stalwarts were also concerned with preserving earlier power arrangements and the DNC's power as an institution. The Miami Convention was thus an explosive mix of competing interests. It would also be a defeat for Chisholm's campaign. However, Chisholm would emerge from the convention with increased power as a legislator and as a political force in Brooklyn. Chisholm was there to exercise Black feminist power politics. In other words, she was using what leverage she had to push the party and the nominee toward her vision of political equity within the intersections of race, sex, and class. She wanted pledges to support government programs for equity and would demand a black vice president, a woman secretary of health, education, and welfare, and an indigenous secretary of the interior. But she also hesitated to dictate a program. She, above all, wanted to be a rallying point, a catalyst, to stimulate the seizing of political power by her coalition, not dictate an agenda. To do so, she still needed more delegates. With the delegate count so close between Humphrey and McGovern, her hope was to have a consequential number of votes with which to bargain. There were still delegates, mostly black, who could be persuaded to vote for Chisholm on the first ballot, that is, to remain uncommitted to either frontrunner. Still, McGovern seemed to be tying up more and more votes from black and women delegates. Chisholm was aware of and disappointed with the political games underway in the delegate race. Quote, there was a lot of dishonesty that was going on with these big fat white gentlemen with these big stomachs running around. It was not right, she remembered. In particular, she suspected that campaigns were buying delegates for money. She was also disappointed by a lack of support from those she considered allies. Even Humphrey, with whom she found common cause in challenging California's winner-take-all system, and whom she saw as essentially decent, tried to appear to be more of a supporter than he really was. Bella Abzug similarly declared herself a supporter, but did nothing to help Chisholm's campaign. Steinem, too, was a self-declared Chisholm supporter, but led the NWPC, that's the National Women's Political Caucus, into backing McGovern. Chisholm thought it would have been embarrassing for them to not to support her as a woman, but she discovered any embarrassment was outweighed by their desire to back a winner on the first ballot. She was similarly frustrated by the lack of support from most black political colleagues. Despite these frustrations, and the fact that Chisholm was glad when the campaign was over, she was glad she had done it. I never lost faith in the democratic process, she stated later. I will stop there.
And for all those people who said they wanted to back a winner, McGovern lost by the biggest landslide against him in the history of the United States. So much for picking a winner. Thank you.
Well.
Anyway, I was very thrilled to be asked to make some comments and to facilitate questions. Anastasia and I go back to '06, we think it was, when I started the project on Shirley Chisholm, and this is a wonderful book. It's just terrific. So I urge you to buy it, to read it. Christmas, Mother's Day, Father's Day, graduation, you name it, presents. But more importantly, if any of you are educators, get this book into your schools. When I started the project, I would go into the public schools and ask the students if they'd ever heard of Shirley Chisholm, and they hadn't. I would always begin my talk by saying, do you know who Barack Obama is? Well, sure. Do you know who Hillary Clinton is? Yeah, sure. Do you know who Shirley Chisholm is? They didn't know. And so this is why this book is so very important. Which leads me to my first question, which is sort of twofold. One, what got you interested? And two, why do you think Chisholm just, until very recently, has been, as they say, written out of history?
Thank you. You know, in some ways, I wrote this book with you looking over my shoulder. And so what you say means a lot to me. I've had a request to do a little show and tell and answer these questions. And it's, you can't see from where you're sitting, but I can point you to this and you can look in your own copies. So on page 355, there's an image. And on the right side of this image is a man named Steve Curwood. He is a relation to my father. And then next to him is a woman whose name then was Wendy Curwood. That's my mother. And then Jean Rubenstein, campaign manager for Massachusetts. And then Mrs. Chisholm is on the right side of the photograph. So I saw this photograph. This is the photograph that really started the book. I saw this photograph as a young child. And I actually thought that that Mrs. Chisholm was my aunt, because my aunt was a really good dresser too, and had a hairdo at the time that was a little bit like that, and so I thought that she was my father's sister, and so I said, who is that? Is that Auntie Sally? And my parents said, no, that's Shirley Chisholm. She ran for president one day. You can too. I was like, okay, cool. I didn't say cool back then, but okay. And then I thought about running for president for a few years. I considered, I explored with my campaign manager and my surrogates and all that. I just looked in the mirror and I said, should I run for president? And then I remember thinking, no, it's not a good job. It's a really tough job, and I don't think I want that kind of headache. And so I decided against. But the fact of the matter is, as a young child, I could seriously consider this. That this was something that was an option for me to think about. And so I had that, in my background. As it turned out, my mother was a treasurer for the campaign in Massachusetts, and my father was a journalist at the time and was covering it. And this photo was taken by a family friend who also took a cover photo. Then I went looking, fast forward several decades, I'm a junior faculty member looking to plan a course on Black biography. And Black biography is history. And I thought, well, I would love to read a Shirley Chisholm biography, so I'll assign one of those. And all I could find was some children's books and young adult books that were old, not appropriate for college class. So at the time, I was thinking about what my next project would be, and that was the decision I made, was to write this. But it took a long time, and it took me personally a long time. I'm not a fast writer. I changed jobs. I had some archival challenges that you are very familiar with, and we can talk about later, or in the Q&A. But the other thing is, why I thought I would be scooped. I was sure I would be scooped in the 15 years since I first had the idea for the book, and to now. I thought somebody else would write something, and they didn't. And I did.
But
Yes.
mine's very different, I assure you.
Yes. In the 15 years since I first thought about writing the book, we have these just 2 books written for grown-ups on this topic. So at the time, I was thinking, well, it's, maybe it's too recent, but I've come to think that it's because she's so iconic, that people don't like to see symbols as actual human beings, and that actually she had a life. She was born. She had a human body, a whole childhood, a complex personality. And then even after her run for president, she was in Congress for a total of 14 years. She was there 10 years after she ran for president, and she had an old age. And so she's been seen as a symbol so much. And so it's kind of hard to see someone as a full person. The other thing I must acknowledge is that Black women are very much underrepresented in terms of biographies. And Black women are seen as sort of a niche topic, or somehow irrelevant to the rest of the world or the rest of Americans. That's changing. My mentor Nell Irvin Painter wrote a biography of Sojourner Truth, another deeply symbolic figure. And now I'm part of a collective of Black women writing biographies of Black women. Yeah, although I've actually, mine is the first book to come out. I was at the later stages when we formed this. But now that we're building this pipeline and trying to get these really important lives talked about. So that's a very long answer to your question.
Well, we're glad.
Try to be succinct.
We're glad you did, and it's very important. I think part of the problem is, and I've written about this, is a lot of women like Mrs. Chisholm, even Rosa Parks, their papers are very scattered, and it's very difficult to get them. So my book is very different, but this is sort of a complete biography, and it did take you about 15 years to track down all. It takes that much time because where are Mrs. Chisholm's papers? Well, most of them are at Brooklyn College, but they're with the family, and quite often families, especially of African American women, are very loath to have you see some of the personal documents. Maybe there's certain personal things. Deborah Gray White writes about how quite often Black women do not necessarily want all their dirty laundry or their clean laundry. So it's a very difficult thing. I'm glad you started with Barbados, because people mainly know about Barbados as the home of the vacation spot of the rich and famous. However, it's an island with a very important political history and ties to the United States, even before there was the United States. So I'd like to know a little bit more, what you did learn, what you did not know, and what were you surprised to know about Barbados at the time when I met Mrs. Chisholm once, so I still refer to her as Mrs. Chisholm.
And all the people who I interviewed refer to her as Mrs. Chisholm. Yeah. So sometimes people want to say, "Oh, Shirley this." I think the kids did in the campaign, like they say Shirley, but she's Mrs. Chisholm. Going to Barbados was absolutely essential in writing the book, as I suspect you found it.
Oh, absolutely.
To be as well. What I did in Barbados was genealogy and learning the landscape. But the genealogy I found was so essential for understanding what kind of family Chisholm came from, and therefore her relevance now. Let me explain more specifically. I was able to trace her father's side of the family to her great-grandfather, who had been emancipated when the British Caribbean abolished slavery in 1831. And I followed him. He got married in the 1830s to a woman who also was enslaved. So those great-grandparents, I found them. But I can't find them in the record before because their names were George and Sarah. And there are so many Georges and Sarahs in the parish where they lived who were enslaved before that point. I don't know which one it was. But I found her father's side of the family's roots that far back. And this is what's so important. She was a daughter of the Caribbean. Remember that the Caribbean was made by slavery. Why are there all these Black people in Barbados, in Jamaica? It's because they're forcibly brought there. And the deep connections between enslaved people in the Caribbean and enslaved people here mean that there's much more in common than people often think. One thing that, well, first of all, let me also say that Chisholm in the very first pages of Unbought and Unbossed says that my father, Charles St. Hill, was a native of British Guyana who had grown up in Cuba and Barbados. He was technically a native of British Guiana because he was born there while his parents were there for 2 years. They were Barbadian. He was brought back to Barbados. He was baptized in Barbados. He was Barbadian. And it's interesting that she said that he wasn't. And so I went back to look and see how deep his family roots were, and they were very, very deep in Barbados. So that was one thing. But the impact of slavery on her family, she was descended from enslaved people who were forcibly brought in the Middle Passage. And she shares that with other Black Americans that she encountered here in Brooklyn and in the United States. And that common thread, sometimes Americans don't like to think about Caribbean people as having that same, as having lived that same reality, but that common thread really brought her together with Black people across the diaspora and here in the United States.
I just want to add something that I learned. Well, two things, but one thing is when we study the Panama Canal, we think of U.S. imperialism. But the people who built, Teddy Roosevelt did not build the Panama Canal. It was largely Barbadian and Jamaican workers. And what the building of the Panama Canal allowed for, I'm just going to, the case of Barbadians, for the first time they actually earned money. And it was called Panama Gold. And Chisholm's family could come to the United States, and Muriel, her sister, told me, because of Panama Gold, and many of the women had wedding rings made out of Panama Gold. So as historians, it's always wonderful to know that on the one hand, Teddy Roosevelt, carry a big stick and be a horrible imperialist, but on the other hand, the fact that Jamaican and Barbadian workers worked on the canal enabled them to get a little bit of economic independence and come to the United States. I want to say something else, and maybe you'll comment on it about Barbados. In Barbados, the majority of people were Black. Chisholm grew up, she saw Black bus drivers, she had Black teachers, Black ministers. She comes to Brooklyn and she doesn't. Would you comment on the Caribbean experience? Because it was different and it created rifts between people who were born in the African Americans born in the United States and Afro-Caribbeans.
Yeah, I'm glad you made that explicit because that's why it's notable that there are these common roots. But yes, there are these divisions. So as a person growing up for 6 years in Barbados, she saw Black people in positions of authority. Black people were the smartest people in town and the dumbest people in town and the richest people in town. And there are a number of white, wealthy Barbadians exploiting Black Barbadians. But in general, she saw this whole spectrum of Blackness. When she came back to the United States, as you know, she was in a Jewish neighborhood, didn't see very many Black people. And then finally her family moved her into the housing projects, and that's when she first heard the N-word, and she first noticed these divisions between people, and that stayed with her really through her career, and there were all, I will even tell you that there are a few haters on Twitter who will say things like, well, Shirley Chisholm was not a descendant of American slaves. There's this whole ADOS, American Descendant of Slaves movement, and therefore we should not be embracing her as a Black American.
Well, U.S. slaves.
Yeah, right. But that's the thing. This is the thing, is that no, she is a descendant of the Americas, this side of the Atlantic world, and slavery. And we've talked about this, that Bridgetown was a stop for slave ships, bringing the first stop after the transatlantic leg, and then people were brought to Charleston, Savannah, New Orleans. and became slaves in the United States. But that division did persist, and you know, she had all sorts of trouble with the New York Amsterdam News, and with those who said she didn't really represent the interests of Black Americans.
It's not that dissimilar to the original opposition of older civil rights workers to Barack Obama. I mean, they referred to,
point.
oh, he's not really black in the way,
Hasn't paid his dues.
even Jesse Jackson said that.
Yeah.
One bit of information since we're in Brooklyn. Manhattan, the original wealth of Manhattan came from cotton slavery. Brooklyn came from sugar, and that came from Barbados. Yeah.
I have Myers.
If any of you ever saw the Kara Walker sugar exhibit that was in Brooklyn about 8-9 years ago. Anyway, she begins her activism at, we've got a few minutes left, but I just wanted to no, I think let's talk about her coalition building, because that's the main thing, and then I want to have discussions and questions.
Yeah, coalitions, okay. So Chisholm was a coalition politician. She was, because of her own self, her very body, her existence, at the intersection of categories of identity that we recognize. So she's a Black woman, and she's experiencing disempowerment along both of those axes. So she's practicing intersectionality before Kimberly Crenshaw named it. She could not separate her blackness from her femaleness, or vice versa. So she understood that people inhabit different identities or constraints, worlds simultaneously. As an intersectional person herself, she saw the potential for coalitions of people at intersections to gel. So what did she mean by that? Well, who cares about childcare? In 1971, it was welfare rights activists, it was feminists, the feminist movement, it was educators, it was, let's see, all sort. There's a broad coalition. Parents. So there's this broad coalition. So that coalition comes together in what would have been the 1971 Comprehensive Child Development Act, which would have created universal child care in this country. It was passed through both houses of Congress, got through conference committee. She chaired the conference committee, and Richard Nixon declined to sign it because he said it was a radical piece.
It would Sovietize American
children.
children. That's the exact quote.
So, so that didn't work. Although the next year she was able to get some budget elements to support childcare, but imagine if we lived in a world with universal childcare in this country. Imagine what kind of a different place it would be. So that's an element of coalition, and she was able. Louise Day Hicks, famous segregationist from Boston, she and Louise Day Hicks discussed childcare together. So that's one coalition. Another coalition, Title IX, for example. So there are people, there are athletes, there are again feminists, and women, educators again. So she helped pull those coalitions together. So she said coalition isn't always easy. It's not always comfortable for those who are involved, because you're different people. You have a different set of interests. But what's key is you identify the common interests, and then you use that point, that pressure point, to move things along, to make change. That was what I was trying to explain in the passage that I read. It's what she was trying to do with her run for president. It's what she did with minimum wage for domestic workers. It's what she did when she was trying to fight the Reaganomics and the Reagan Revolution. That's how she operated, was with coalitions.
And when she was running for president, when Anastasia's father was on the campaign committee, the coalition in Massachusetts, both in the primary, was she worked with the McGovern people, even though she couldn't stand them. She worked with the emerging, in the language of the 70s, lesbian and gay movement, and she was not homophobic at all. In fact, she was fascinated by we have an interview with Bevan Dufty, but she also worked with veterans. She worked with, she had great support from, in those days, called the Grey Panthers, and I think when Older Women's Liberation was founded, you had to be 30 to join, so that's not old. But people credit the fact that Massachusetts did go for McGovern had to do with the coalition work that Mrs. Chisholm had done.
Yeah, literal coalition slates.
Yes.
In the Massachusetts primaries.
So let's get your comments, questions.
Yeah, comments and questions.
This is a question for you as a writer, first-time biographer.
Yeah.
In this massive project that it seems obviously personal to you, talking about such early exposure, and it took you 15 years to complete. What kept you continuing and staying on this project? Because you mentioned earlier the difficulties of acquiring papers that are in different places and things like that. So I imagine that's the why it took so long in many ways. But what helped stay together? What helped you stay together in that process?
Yeah. Well, a few things. One is the how much I thought it was important to tell the story, and the fact that Barbara had gone to the trouble of assembling this archive and then creating a biography that showed, okay, well, this can be done, and there is a need for this.
Mm-hmm.
So I knew that it could and should be done. I was committed to the topic itself. And then the second thing is just general advice for general reflection for any writer. I'm just stubborn. Just every day. I had some writing accountability groups that I participated in, the kind that get you writing every day. And so even if I could just write 15 minutes a day or just spend 15 minutes a day with the project, I just did that. It's just pure stubbornness.
Good for you.
So, so it's more perspiration than inspiration at many points. And sometimes reading the book, it might seem like any good writing in the book is because I just sat with it and just kept revising and persisting with it. That's really, there's no magic.
Good for you, really.
Yeah, thank you. That's a great question. So I'm a slow writer, but I'm a determined writer. Yeah.
You were talking about like the perhaps fear for some people to write a biography about her because of this like iconic sort of status. Were there things that you learned or discovered that like sort of stood like in contrast to that, or like reflected interestingly on that sort of iconic status that something some people might not know about that you really appreciated learning in the process?
Well, sure. Do I talk about the money? Let's talk about the money. So Chisholm came from a working class family that was very determined to, I don't know how much you know about Barbadian families in Brooklyn, but Barbadian families in Brooklyn tended to be very driven to accumulate enough wealth to buy a house. That's a big deal. And so, and basically clawed themselves into the middle class. And so So Chisholm's family did that, and when her father passed away in 1960, so Chisholm was 36 years old, he left behind a modest inheritance that everybody had contributed to. She had 3 sisters and a mom. They all worked. But in his name, he had a modest inheritance, and then he had bought a life insurance policy that named her as the sole beneficiary.
Chisholm, Shirley Chisholm.
Yeah,
Wow.
yeah. And so they all got the piece of the modest estate, and then she got this other special lump of money. It's about $8,000 or $10,000. The family was very displeased. She wrote that she was her father's favorite, that he wanted her to go forward in politics, that she was special, and there's no way to know how it transpired that she was named the beneficiary of this, but she did not share the money with the family, and in fact the family had a permanent rift over it. And then this was in 1960, so by the time all the paperwork was done, it would have been 60 or 61. She ran for New York State Assembly in 1964. Political campaigns are expensive. Families are priceless, but in her case, it was worth the trade-off. She was very, very, very ambitious. And I mentioned, the part that I read, some people saw her as arrogant and self-aggrandizing, and some people saw her as idealistic, and both of those things exist in the same person. That was what she really wanted to get involved in politics, and that was her nest egg to do it.
Can I add one other story
Please,
too?
yeah.
That one of the people I interviewed and I read was Wayne Barrett, who did not like her at all. And Wayne Barrett is a very brilliant, honest, investigative journalist and left of center. And he was it along with Cooper, wrote wrote essays.
And really.
Andrew, yeah, oh, believe me. But what they argued was after 72, Chisholm was not bought, but she was bossed. And that in order for her to stave off primary campaigns, because there were a lot of younger black men who wanted that campaign, she went along with the New York Democratic Party bosses who were white, and she would usually endorse white candidates over black candidates. And it was really quite a savage criticism. And I think there's a partial truth in it. That is, she was shrewd, she wanted to stay in office, she did not want to be primaried, and she knew she had to play a little bit of the game. But for all the criticisms that Wayne Barrett said, she never took money, but she ended up being one of the wealthiest people in Congress, which in those days, you didn't have money when you were in Congress. I think it had,
And there's she was advocating for different rules about money, what money people in Congress
because she got money from speaking.
Yes, and so she thought, well, why is it that, we can't keep this, I'm trying to remember what she was arguing, but she was saying, well, it's hypocritical that, or you can keep your stock money, but you can't keep your speaking fees, or you have to declare. And she did really well.
Yes, she did.
And her estate was worth about, when she died, her estate was worth over $1 million. Well, she had over $1 million in cash. And then there's the house in Florida, which is quite nice too. So.
But that's only worth $130,000 now.
Yeah.
I mean, that's another story.
Yeah.
But can I just say something about the money? What is interesting in terms of the speaking engagement is now because we've brought Congress people to come and speak on the Shirley Chisholm Day, and they can't take an honorarium, but you know what they want? You can write the check to their political action campaign.
Yeah. She got a lot of money from speaking.
Other questions?
To put anyone on the spot here.
If there aren't any other questions, I do want to take an opportunity to thank you both. for joining us at Greenlight tonight. And I want to encourage you all and you all to please support Anastasia Curwood in purchasing Shirley Chisholm. Can we see that beautiful cover one more time?
Yeah, where is my
Shirley Chisholm, champion of Black feminist power politics. Thank you, Barbara, for joining in conversation. Barbara also has a book coming out this summer, Revolutionary Feminists, A History of the Women's Liberation Movement. So thank you both so much.
And thank you.
Yeah, and it was really great having you all.